Good evening and welcome. My name's William White, and on behalf of the Ford's electors, it's a wonderful delight to welcome you here to this socially distanced lecture, which we didn't think was ever going to happen because we've been waiting for it for 2 years, but we are finally here. Thank you for coming, and thank you to those of you who are joining us online this evening. The Ford Special Lecture is one of the most prestigious in the faculty's armoury of invitations, and this evening we are enormously grateful to be able to honour and invite one of the most distinguished historians of modern Britain and modern global history. Professor Catherine Hall of University College London is somebody whose work has not only been widely read, cited, discussed, taught and thought about, but also somebody who, through her work, has been able to transform the discipline of history multiple times, not just once, but on several occasions throughout her career. She began her career as a pioneering historian of women and of gender, and her work, written with Leonor Davidoff, Family Fortunes, remains a fundamental text for understanding the gendered experience, not just of 19th century Britain, its apparent subject, but more generally for discussing how one writes women and gender history throughout all time. She then moved on to consider how gender and citizenship and questions of race interacted in the 19th century, and in books like Defining the Victorian Nation, Civilising Subjects, and most recently Macaulay and Son, she has helped turn British history from what could be seen as rather a narrow and insular perspective in order to see how the empire shaped Britishness as much as Britain shaped the empire, and how categories of race, class and gender intersected and transformed the lived experience of Britons in the 19th and 20th century. Alongside this work, she's of course been a pioneer of digital histories, and through her work championing the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, has helped shed new light and help transform our understanding of the ways in which slavery and the legacies of slavery again helped make modern Britain. Because of this work, she has been awarded multiple prizes and distinguished fellowships, as well as honorary degrees, and most recently the Leverhulme Medal of the British Academy. So it's enormously kind of her to come and join us, and we feel honoured that she's been able to do this. And we do so bearing in mind not just the rich legacy of work that she's done, but also the ways in which her work has constantly not simply shaped the discipline of history, but also thought hard about how history can shape the modern world as well as the past. My work, she writes, has been driven by the conviction that historical understanding can contribute to the task of tackling contemporary social, cultural, political and economic inequalities. This stands very close to the values of the history faculty as we start to explore how our work can have a wider impact and can also be shaped by those issues. It stands close to what we're doing at St John's in our project on St John's and the Colonial Past. And so for all those reasons, it's tremendously exciting to be able to welcome Professor Catherine Hall as she gives the Ford Special Lecture, Racial Capitalism Across the Black-White Atlantic. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much, Professor White, for that very generous introduction. And my thanks to you and to the history faculty for this invitation to give the Ford Lecture. It's a much delayed event due to the pandemic, and it is lovely to be here in person, even in this sort of sparsely filled room due to all the restrictions. But I've recently done my first in-person events, and I must say, it's just lovely because the interaction is very different from what's possible on screen. So, thank you. Well, my story this evening begins with Edward Long. He was the third son of a gentry family whose wealth had been derived over 3 generations from the labor of the enslaved on the plantations in Jamaica, which they had owned since the 1650s. His great-grandfather, Samuel, was one of the founding fathers of the colony of Jamaica. Edward was born and educated in England and had expected to live his life here as a gentleman lawyer. He also fancied himself as a writer. But the unexpected death of his father in 1757 left him with what was thought to be a meagre inheritance for a gentleman. He was advised by his uncle Beeston, the head of the London West India Merchant House of Drake and Long, to go to Jamaica, where he could expect to make a fortune. The understanding of Jamaica in 18th century Britain was that it was a pretty awful place, but a place to make money. Aged 23, he borrowed capital and established himself as a planter, buying one of the family plantations called Lucky Valley from his older brother, Robert. So this is a map of Jamaica in 1804 that we've made very heavy use of on our website, done lots of work with this map. And you can see, oh, it hasn't, you can't see it, hang on. There we go. So if you can just see the blue lines which mark out the parish of Clarendon, which was in the centre of the island and not far from Spanish Town, which was the capital, and then the 2 plantations belonging to the Long family, Lucky Valley and Longville. So Edward Long set about improving the property in the favoured language of the time, determined to make as much money as possible so that he could return to the mother country. Within months of his arrival, this eligible young Englishman had made an advantageous marriage to Mary Ballard Beckford, the daughter of an established slave-owning family on the island. He was determined that his children should be educated in England. During his 11 years in Jamaica, he bought enslaved people and land, rebuilt the works at Lucky Valley, and managed to increase the yield of sugar and rum very substantially. In 1760, the year after his arrival, the major rebellion, known as Taki's Rebellion, took place, the most important uprising of enslaved people in the Atlantic world, prior to the successful revolution in Haiti. It was an event which left him fully aware of the dangers inherent to the society which the colonists had made, with its massive demographic imbalance of roughly 10 to 1, black people to white. Elected as a member of the House of Assembly, the representative body for propertied white men, he took a very active part in colonial politics, asserting the rights of freeborn Englishmen to their legal and political privileges. By 1759, he had accumulated enough capital to pay off his debts and was able to return to England with his young family, expecting to live the life of a well-to-do West Indian, thanks to his Jamaican property, both in land and people, and the ever-expanding demand in England for king sugar. On his return, he found that much had changed. The end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 had brought a signal increase in Britain's global power. New territories meant substantial new populations of mixed ethnicities and religious beliefs, provoking questions about the meaning and extent of British subjecthood. When he had left England in 1757, few voices had been raised against colonial slavery, which was commonly accepted as contributing to Britain's wealth and power. By the time he returned, the questions as to whether slavery was legal in England, the celebrated land of liberty, had become a matter of public concern. A variety of legal opinions had been made about this, but there was no clear legal judgment. The slave trade had clearly been legislated for in Parliament, but what about slavery itself? By 1770, both pro-slavers and their antagonists were ready to test the issue in the courts. The case of James Somerset provided the opportunity. Somerset had been brought to England by the man who claimed ownership of him, James Stuart, but had managed to escape. He was subsequently kidnapped onto a ship for passage to the Caribbean and re-enslavement. The case came before Lord Mansfield, the Lord Chief Justice, and in 1772, Mansfield freed Somerset, declaring slavery to be repugnant at home. He demarcated between England, a place that did not permit the kidnapping of Africans in order to re-enslave them, and the colonies, places where slavery was legitimate. The West Indians were enraged. This challenged their right as freeborn Englishmen to hold what they believed was their property. Long's first act was to pen a furious polemic against Mansfield, who had attempted, as he put it, to wash the blackamoor white. He had been planning for some time to write a history of Jamaica. This history, he now realized, if it were to be authoritative, needed something much more than polemic. In the wake of the Somerset decision, he had to convince his metropolitan audience that colonial slavery was essential to British wealth and power, that black people were naturally different, unequal, and born to serve those who were white. The Somerset trial marked an iconic moment, a moment of rupture in metropolitan understandings of racial difference. Thinking about the slave trade and slavery as in some respects un-English had broken through an established common sense of its acceptability. Slavery was beginning to be seen as repugnant in the metropole. This heralded a new conjuncture, a time of intensifying struggle when anti-slavery voices were no longer marginalized, but gradually moving into the center ground of politics and culture. The protracted struggle that ensued only concluded more than half a century later with the abolition of slavery in 1834. That moment was in turn to usher in a new conjuncture, new articulations of racial hierarchy, new struggles over the meanings of race and freedom, a new configuration of the connections between racism and capitalism. I actually meant to show you this before, but anyway, I'll show you now. So this is one of the maps that we've created on our database. Using James Robertson's map, we've identified all the estates that we've been able to track in terms of British slave ownership. And the white dots that you see, when you go onto the map interactively, you can click on them and the details of the estate come up. So we're very proud of these maps, I have to say, and they took a great deal of work. And these are the two estates, Lucky Valley and Longville. So then here we have Edward Long as he was represented in 1796, so quite late on, and that engraving is in the National Portrait Gallery. And this then is the frontispiece of his History of Jamaica. Long published his 3-volume History of Jamaica anonymously in 1774. He was speedily recognized as the author and established as the authority on the island. The work circulated in the US as well as in the Anglo world, and it has remained in print ever since. The text has been mined by innumerable scholars of the Caribbean on every aspect of Jamaica, its inhabitants, plantation economy, political system, topography, and natural history. It's well known to those interested in the intellectual history of race, for it was one of the first texts in English to maintain that racial difference was essential and natural, that inequality was ordained by providence, embodied in blood, skin, and hair. For Jamaicans, it is an infamous text, the most influential account of a colonial racial system which was reconfigured after emancipation, but whose traces remain all too clearly on the island into the present. For Peter Fryer, whose staying power was one of the first 20th century histories of Black Britons, Long was the father of English racism. Edward Long is the man, and his History of Jamaica, the subject of my current work. People ask me, how can you bear to spend so long with such an obnoxious figure whose writing has had such damaging effects and whose racist thinking still reverberates? My answer is that a better understanding of the entangled histories of Britain and the West Indian islands they colonized can hope to play a part in repairing the damage wrought by slavery and colonialism. That harm can never be put right, but the recognition that there is a debt to be paid, one that stretches from the past into the present, is critical to hopes for a more egalitarian future. The work of reparation for slavery and colonialism is concerned with the relationship between past and present. It was the English who established the colonial system and racial slavery in Jamaica. We were not there then, but those of us who live in Britain now are beneficiaries of the gross inequalities associated with that history. The persistent poverty of the Caribbean has been a constituting condition for ill-gotten European prosperity into the present, as David Scott put it. Racialized inequalities in contemporary society have their roots in slavery days. There is a debt to be paid. Investment in infrastructure is vital, as CARICOM, the governmental body representing the region, insists, but it will not happen without a recognition from Britons of our historic involvement with the slavery business, our responsibilities, given the ways in which our lives have been enriched over centuries. The Legacies of British Slave Ownership project over the last decade has focused on unpicking the story that Britain liked to tell itself of the gift of abolition and emancipation, revealing the scale of the wealth amassed by British slave owners and exploring the part they played in the development of modern Britain. But their wealth only constituted a part of what they transmitted. West Indians returned to the metropole with ideas and practices of racial difference and hierarchy, which became embedded in British culture, politics, and institutions. Those ideas were and are always contested, but we continue to live with forms of institutional racism and inequality, which have not least structured the figures on mortality associated with COVID-19. Edward Long was a key architect both of the practices and the theoretical justifications for racialization. He named himself and his family white with a capital W, owners of property and freedom. Enslaved men and women, in his parlance, were Negroes, a term that I only use when quoting directly from 18th century texts. As a white English historian, I have chosen to focus on two of my most influential white predecessors, both of whom normalized white power. First, Macaulay, for his elaboration of an island story and erasure of colonialism and empire, now Long, who understood the importance of empire but saw it as built on racial difference. As a white historian, I have my own debt to pay, one connected to my familial link to Jamaica, my knowledge of the long and terrible legacies of a hierarchy based on the colour of skin. My work, as I understand it, is to unpick Long's history, grasping what it can tell us about colonialism and exposing the contradictions in his thinking, the impossibility of fixing racial categories as he tried so hard to do. I'm doing what historians do all the time, rewriting in the light of new evidence, new thinking, new conditions of life and politics. I began my work on Long, assuming that my focus would be on the ways in which he theorized racial difference. But the more I read, the more I realized that he was providing me with an account of the workings of racial capitalism in the mid-18th century. What do I mean by racial capitalism? It's a term that has come to be widely used in the recent past, particularly in the United States, and has entered more popular discourse in the wake of Black Lives Matter as a way of asserting that capitalism must be addressed alongside structural forms of racism. The two are intimately connected, and the expropriation and exploitation of racialized people have historically gone hand in hand with forms of capitalist accumulation. Efforts to theorize these systemic connections, often building on Marx, have been led by black radical intellectuals such as Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, Cedric Robinson. Our understanding of the concept has been substantially expanded by black feminists from Hortense Spillers to Jennifer Morgan and Françoise Vergès, who have demonstrated how the bodies and wombs of enslaved and free black women have been appropriated to the interests of capital. The account I offer this evening of racial capitalism is specific to the mid-18th century, across what I call the black-white Atlantic. This is the binary that capitalists and colonists tried to make, one that has been constantly challenged, but that still carries immense power. There is no generic slavery and capitalism, no abstract race or labor or capital. Rather, we need to focus on the specificities of time and place. The system that Du Bois explored in 1920 in The Souls of White Folk, or that Walter Johnson explicates in his wonderful book River of Dark Dreams, which deals with cotton, steamboats, the Mississippi, New York, and Liverpool in the 19th century, are different from that which I explore in relation to sugar, Jamaica, West Africa, and London. Sugar-based plantation slavery in the 18th century was organized within a mercantilist framework that privileged the metropole both economically and politically and subordinated the interests of the colony. Jamaica was there to serve the interests of the Crown, heavily involved as it was with the development of the slave trade, and overseas merchants. The island produced an export crop, sugar, within a system of imperial preference. The colonists relied on military and naval support against internal and external enemies. Any legislation they passed in their representative assembly, peopled by propertied men, was subject to Crown approval. This limited political autonomy depended on the revenue paid to the Crown. Jamaica was subordinate to Britain. The system of West India trade that developed over time across the Atlantic was complex and hybrid, transformative of African and Caribbean societies and the mercantile capitalism of early modern Britain. It marked a particular phase in the development of racial capitalism, when goods were exchanged for people, cane was transformed into sugar and rum. The circuit operated from England to West Africa, the Atlantic to the Caribbean, and back to Britain, utilizing different regimes of exploitation. Captives were violently seized in West Africa with no payment. They were sold on the coast by African traders to Europeans. Men, women, and children were priced and became human property. White sailors working for wages manned the ships. Once in Jamaica, Africans were renamed as slaves and Negroes with a new price. Their labor, once purchased, involved no monetary cost for their owner for the rest of their lives. They were human capital, the most valuable asset of the plantation. The sugar and rum were shipped back to the metropole by predominantly white-waged labor. White men manned the docks, the warehouses, the counting houses, and the refineries where the molasses were processed. This hybrid system of exploitation of enslaved and waged labor depended on the circuit of bills of exchange. Promissory notes of credit crisscrossed the Atlantic and allowed credit to flow, debts to mushroom, capital to accumulate. There was no abstract economic logic operating only according to the rules of the market. Each moment in the circuit of capital, production, reproduction, distribution, and consumption, was embedded legally and politically in racialized, gendered, and class practices. In Jamaica, economic relations articulated with the legal, political, and cultural practices of the colonists, institutionalizing freedom as white and slavery as black. The colonial state legislated slave codes with specific disciplinary regimes. At the very same time, white men were secured in their property and their political and legal rights. Colonists could hope not only to secure a fortune, but to create a dynasty through practices of marriage and inheritance. Indeed, the Long family did, though many others failed, and levels of white mortality were extremely high. Jamaica was an island of death, as Vincent Brown writes, a place that literally consumed its inhabitants. The island was protected by the British Navy and military. Garrisons, barracks, and fortified houses were designed to keep colonists safe from rebels and from the Spanish and the French. Space was racialized, land privatized, boundaries marked as to who could travel freely, who belonged where, which places were designated for which people. Racial hierarchies were codified in law and practiced in custom. They were lived in the towns and on the plantations and pens across the island. It is impossible to detail all this in one talk, and you would not want me to. Tonight, I am focusing on the circuit of capital and its reproduction, drawing on Edward Long's account. His starting point was what he called the Negro trade, the groundwork of all. The Negro trade, the groundwork of all, was a trade in which it was people who were bought and sold. The very naming captures the commoditization that took place. Their capture and enslavement, in Long's mind, saved them from a worse fate in Africa, and he provided his readers with a graphic, imagined depiction of the barbarism of that continent in the attempt to convince them and himself of the legitimacy of the trade. The Negro slaves, as he described them, connecting the two terms, linking blackness to slavery, were purchased by British merchants in Africa, usually with British goods. They were carried to the Caribbean in British ships, sold to British planters, who then furnished them with the instruments for their labour and their lives with British goods. Thousands of Britons were engaged in the ancillary trades: shipbuilders, sailors, dock workers, metal workers in copper and iron, textile labourers in cotton and linen, sugar refiners, grocers. These and many more were earning their livelihoods, facilitating the slave trade and provisioning the plantations. "If we revolve in our minds," wrote Long, "what an amazing variety of trades received their daily support, as many of them did originally their being, from the calls of the Africa and West India markets. If we reflect on the numerous families of those mechanics and artisans which are thus maintained, and contemplate that ease and plenty which is the constant as well as just reward of their incessant labours, if we combine with these the several tribes of active and busy people who are continually employed in shipping, we may from thence form a competent idea of the prodigious value of our sugar colonies and a just conception of their immense importance to the grandeur and prosperity of their mother country." These mechanics and artisans were the white waged workers whose labour contributed to the circuit of capital and the success of the slavery business. By the second half of the 18th century, an increasing proportion of the credit and the bills of exchange that moved between slave traders, ships' captains, colonial factors, and slave owners was coming from merchant houses in London, such as that of Drake and Long, established by Edward's uncle, Beast and Long. The merchant house provided credit for the slave traders who dealt with the ship's captains. They in turn negotiated with the African traders on the west coast. The captives were delivered to factors in the Caribbean, who also presented bills of exchange to the merchants. The merchants provided credit and goods to the planters, who were sending sugar and rum in payment. The expense of establishing a plantation, acquiring land, buying labour, building works, meant that extensive capital was required. No profit could be expected for several years. Planters had to rely on credit and were always in debt to the merchants. The merchants also supplied the sugar brokers and refiners, who in turn dealt with the grocers and retailers who sold to the consumers. The market for sugar was expanding exponentially in the 18th century. The merchants, as the holders of the bills of exchange, were key to this web of transactions. They took on an extraordinary variety of roles, provisioning the ships en route to the Caribbean with the tools, building materials, clothing, and household wares for the plantations, handling insurance, dealing with lawyers, inspecting the sugar on arrival, managing customs at the docks, checking, weighing, and warehousing, negotiating with government departments and ministers, finding skilled craftsmen, writing letters and copying accounts, acting in loco parentis for children whose parents were on the islands. Their profit, documented in their ledgers, was made from commissions and interests on loans. Merchants could make, and sometimes lose, great fortunes investing their capital in a range of activities, from country houses and cultural doings to enterprises that fueled the building of modern Britain. It was the merchants who were able to extract high levels of profit with their command over prices and credit. These were the merchant capitalists. Long strongly recommended his own practice of working with London merchants, the true fountainhead of credit, and for him, a part of the family business of Drake and Long. Drake and Long was situated on Leadenhall Street, close to the Bank of England. Edward's uncle, Beast and Long, after an advantageous marriage, was able to build up one of the most successful West India houses, entering a variety of partnerships with kin and other members of the West Indian elite. On the basis of the doings of the merchant house in Leadenhall Street, he bought a country house and at his death left his wife and children very substantial sums. Merchant houses might have as many as 40 correspondents. Drake and Long, whose papers have sadly been lost, dealt with major plantation owners, such as the Pennants, Dawkins, and Morants, as well as with their own family. The reliable acceptance of bills of exchange was key to their business, and trust was of paramount importance. The merchants were shielded from the everyday realities of the business out of which they accrued their fortunes. Kindly Uncle Beeston, as his nephew Edward called him, was always ready to help his family, though he was also attentive to the payment of debts. He operated from his counting house with his clerks and his ledgers, or at the dockside with the hogsheads of sugar and puncheons of rum, working with free labour, never encountering an actual plantation, and very rarely an enslaved African. He could maintain the fiction that he was simply a West India merchant, and sugar was a business like any other. His experience was quite different from that of his nephew Edward, with his day-to-day encounters with the Africans he bought, worked, and sold. Furthermore, it was the planters who carried all the risks and sustained the losses. They were subordinate within the integrated economic enterprise. Distantiation, distancing oneself from what happened somewhere else, distancing oneself from those others who were not like us, became a distinctive style of metropolitan practice, the practice of knowing and not knowing the realities of slavery, the practice of disavowal. It was the slave ships' captains who were contracted to enter the negotiations with the Africans, paying respect to the chiefs and kings and establishing the price of people. Captives were held near the coast and might already have been sold a number of times before they reached Cape Coast Castle, the centre for the English traders from the 1670s. The exchange, people for manufactured goods, was the next stage in the turning of African men, women, and children into enslaved people. Enslavement was a process, as Orlando Patterson has argued. The first stage was the violent uprooting of the person from his or her milieu. Captives had to be made socially dead. They were stripped of personal honor, ritually disempowered, ankles shackled, hands bound, head shaved, clothing removed. Turning captives into commodities, as Stephanie Smallwood explains, required the culture of the market, the idea of exchange. It was combined with mathematical forms of accounting, the traders' ledgers that erased personhood and recorded monetary values. The transactions were characterized by violence and coercion, the use of prisons, the destruction of kinship ties, deprivation on a scale that was to discipline the body without extinguishing the life within. The intention was to make people into objects, to be exchanged for goods and to be held as possessions. The archives produced by the slave trade were dominated by numbers. How many units of merchandise were sold? How many pounds were earned? What was the scale of profit and loss? Mathematical reasoning, as William Petty had declared, was the best means of judging in all concerns of human life. People could be valued in monetary terms. What followed was the crossing of the Atlantic. Imprisonment became enslavement as it traversed the ocean, Emma Christopher suggests. Each set of encounters between white people and black marked a different aspect of racialization. Seamen, disciplining bound captives in the hold, discovered their whiteness and celebrated their liberty, their white skin marking their difference from the Africans. once the destination was reached, the human cargo was prepared for sale. The planters wanted to believe that the slaves were already chattels. They were simply buyers. The work of commoditization had been done. Africans had always bought and sold each other, Long insisted. For them, he maintained, slaves were actual staple products, as much as wool and corn are to Great Britain. There was no illegal duress, he insisted, no problem of depopulation. Long attempted to minimize any horror or violence. Captives were saved from death and destined for a better life in the Caribbean. He was intent on demonstrating that his story was one of improvement. Savage Africans could become industrious Creoles. Jamaica had the largest demand for enslaved people of any British colony, and Kingston was the major slave market, not only for the market, but also for Spanish America. The men and women were sold from the ships moored in Port Royal at the mouth of Kingston's harbour. More than 1 in 10 would have died on the Atlantic, but the monetary value of those who survived had doubled by the time they were sold in Kingston. The slave factors, as they were called, relying on bills of exchange from the merchants, sold on to the planters. The partnerships of Thomas Hibbert were seen as the most reliable in the 1750s and 1760s when Edward Long was buying. The factor would pay the limit demanded by the owners, resell the slaves to the planters for payment in 6, 9, or 12 months, and compensate himself out of the difference between the cash price and the credit price. That way, the factor got the benefits of the markup on sale without the risks of investing in securing and transporting enslaved people. Hibbert had what was called a slave pen behind his property on Orange Street, and he would keep the saltwater slaves, as those who arrived from Africa were called, until they were seasoned. The buying and selling was a serious business. The factor needed to weigh up the financial standing of the client in a transaction where so much depended on bills of exchange. The buyer needed to carefully gauge the status of the human property whose labor he required. In 1769, just before returning to England, Long bought 16 men and women for £755 from the major slave factors Thomas and John Hibbert, together with the future issue and increase of the said female slaves. This was the customary practice, never enshrined in law, of hereditary racial slavery. The babies of enslaved women they were the property of the slave owner. Enslaved men were both capital and labor. For enslaved women, as Jennifer Morgan puts it, to be enslaved meant to be locked into a productive relationship whereby all that your body could do was harnessed to the capital accumulation of another. The names of the men and women Long bought were documented, marking in the denial of their ancestral kin another of the staging posts in the refusal of personhood and respect to Africans. The names chosen by the colonists might be places, Kingston, Havana, and Cumberland, places, people, and seasons unknown to those who had been named, along with the occasional acceptance of an African connection, Philida and Cudjoe. Kingston, Havana, and Cumberland, together with their companions, would have had to walk from Kingston to Lucky Valley, a miserable trek. Once there, they would have encountered for the first time a sugar plantation, with its cane fields, pasture, woodland, and works, carefully laid out as the survey commissioned by Long from a local surveyor, Blair, in 1769 demonstrates. They would never have seen such a factory in the field, in Sidney Mintz's term, combining agricultural and industrial processes, the growing and harvesting of the cane, and the first stages in the extraction of the juice, milling, boiling, and distilling, rendering it into a form, molasses, in which it could be sent to England for refining. The huts in which the enslaved would have lived cannot be seen on this survey, but the new watermill and water wheel that Long had installed were marked. These were located near the centre of the cane fields, so that the distance to carry the cane was reduced as much as possible. A later idealised and sanitised drawing by Berryman, produced for Long's son and suitable for the wall of his country home in England, shows the hills in cane, the river, the extensive work, the houses for the overseer and the doctor, and the Negro houses situated on the hill. There was no great house at Lucky Valley, and Long and his family lived either at Longville, a more elegant setting, 4 miles distant, or in Spanish Town. The saltwater slaves would soon have been dragooned into their various tasks. Such men must be managed at first as if they were beasts, wrote Long. They must be tamed before they can be treated like men. Scarcely any study, Long was to tell his white readers, is more amusing than that of agriculture, the ruggedness of which is constantly smoothed by the allurements of profit. It's hard to imagine the writing of that sentence, its denial of the pains and griefs of the plantation. The enslaved had no allurement of profit in their back-breaking hours of labour. Long had found the plantation in a run-down state in 1760, with 139 enslaved people, many of them old and ill, only producing 60 hogsheads of sugar. His brother Robert had told him it always failed to make a profit. His own timely marriage to Mary brought him property, and this, together with a hefty loan, made it possible for him to invest in the estate, in both people, land, and works. He had learned from the agrarian improvements that had been transforming England. A new watermill and works buildings, gutters and pipes to bring water from the river, adjacent land bought up to increase both the area in cane and the woodlands and pasture, the establishment of a pen for the breeding of stock on the alluvial plains near Old Harbour, a new road linking the plantations to the wharf, new systems of manuring appropriate to the Clarendon soil, and crucially, more labour. By the time he left Jamaica in 1768, he had bought numbers of men and women, so that despite the levels of mortality, there were 296 enslaved people, producing on average 300 hogsheads of sugar and 150 puncheons of rum. They were organised in gangs to maximise labour efficiency and supervised by black drivers and a number of white artisans and bookkeepers. A clear hierarchy of labour was classed, gendered, and racialised. The majority of field work was done by women in the first gang, responsible for the heavy work of hoeing and planting, cutting the cane and delivering it to the mill. The second gang comprised the older women and weaker men who took on the less heavy tasks, while the third gang of children and the old weeded, picked grass, and were kept busy with whatever light tasks needed to be done. The fittest men took on the skilled tasks, often initially trained by white craftsmen. They were the millers and boilers, the coopers, carpenters, wheelwrights, and stockmen. The most trusted men might serve as drivers, enforcing discipline with the whip, under the eye of the white overseer. Violence and coercion were systemic, the power of the slave owner backed up by that of the colonial estate. Responding to the growing critiques of the abolitionists who decried the cruelty of the masters, Long insisted that planters were kindly patriarchs and that Africans became relatively civilized Creoles thanks to slavery. Mortality rates tell a quite different story. Persons enslaved in Jamaica lived at the bare edge of subsistence, were worked excessively hard, and lived short lives. it was probably the most unequal place on earth in this period. When the hours of labour were over, the enslaved were allowed to tend their provision grounds, feed themselves, care as best they could for children, the old and the sick. These provision grounds, as Sylvia Wynter noted long ago, provided a plot, a place of potential ownership and belonging, what would become family land in post-emancipation Jamaica. Long was well aware of the importance of his ownership of the bodies of his enslaved women and their increase. He was deeply attached to his own children, but denied such bonds to those he owned. There could be no crueler demonstration of the distinction between white and black. The failure of the enslaved population of 18th century Jamaica to reproduce itself, the high mortality rates and low birth rate, did not overly concern the planters, as long as it was possible to continue buying cheap new captives. Once there was a threat to the operation of the slave trade, however, it was essential to address the issue. Managing Lucky Valley and Longville meant that Long knew precisely the numbers of African men and women, boys and girls, that he had to buy each year to maintain productivity. He blamed the scale of infant mortality on the bad habits of the women, their use of abortifacients and inadequate childcare. Childbirth is not so easy here as in Africa, he wrote, and many children are annually destroyed, as well as their mothers, by the unskillfulness and absurd management of the Negro midwives. He had to admit that those, quotes, Negroes, quotes, breed the best, utilizing the language of stock, whose labor is least or easiest, and that the birth rate was lower on the sugar estates than amongst domestic laborers or those on the pen. I'm just going to help. I'm almost finished. I'm sorry. If the waste lost in childbirth was reduced, he saw that the price of captives would fall, and so he recommended rewards for mothers who took care of their children. Long describes for us something of what it meant to be a black woman on his plantation and how different it was for those who were white. In so doing, he delineated the system of reproduction which was essential to the trade. Long used Lucky Valley as a model in his History of Jamaica to provide estimates of the capital needed for such a plantation, the varied costs of white and black labor, all the necessary fittings for the works, and the profits that might be expected. By the 1770s, when prices were high, labor could be bought and credit was readily available. The estate was producing an income ranging between £3,000 and £6,000 a year, a profit level of 10%. It was this level of productivity, based on racial slavery, which allowed him to pay off his debts and return to England. Racial capitalism in the 18th century Atlantic was structured by the subordination of the colony to the metropole and by the distinctive sets of encounters that took place in the process of capturing, enslaving, transporting, selling, producing sugar, distributing it, and retailing it. The different moments across the cycle were marked by the activities and exchanges of the traders, the merchants, the African sellers, the captives, the ship's captains and seamen, the factors, the planters, the overseers, the enslaved. For the enslaved, the cycle was embedded in violence, coercion, and terror. Race was the prism through which these gendered and classed relations were mediated in all their specificity, with their distinctive economic, legal, and political articulations. Racial capitalism in this iteration depended on wages as well as whips, workshops, ships and factories as well as plantations, the law, the state, and ideologies, whiteness as well as blackness, freedom as well as slavery. Thank you. You've got to forgive me. It's a pretty heavy topic, I know.
Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful lecture, which was both insightful and incredibly powerful as you explored not only the ways in which racial capitalism was constituted in the 18th century, but also our obligation to deal with it here and now. I think you've agreed to answer some questions, and I wondered if I might start by asking a question about that process of distancing you talked about. And you talked about the ways in which London merchants were able to intellectually distance themselves from what was going on in Jamaica and what was going on in Africa and the trade between the two. And I wondered about Long, because in a way, particularly after the Mansfield case, he needs both to distance himself from Africa and make it clear that what's happening in Jamaica is different from and distinct from what he's arguing happens in Africa. But also, now that Britain, or England at any rate, is a place where slavery is repugnant, he somehow has to distance Jamaica from England in order to make it clear that this is a different environment. Or doesn't he? I mean, in what ways does he make Jamaica English, and in what way does he make Jamaica very distinctively not English in his history?
Well, first of all, on the merchants, I mean, it's partly a matter of the intellectual work they do and the fact that they simply have these ledgers with numerical records, etc., and that's the language in which they talk. But of course, it's also a matter of their emotional lives, that they emotionally distance themselves from the knowledge of what was going on around them on the docks in London. You know, by the 1760s and 1770s, there were critical voices being raised. There were cases going to law of Africans who had managed to escape, like James Somerset, and was recaptured and taken to the courts. And the judgments varied, which was why there was why they wanted a test case. But in other words, there were ways they could perfectly well know what was going on, but they chose not to know what's going on. And so the concept of disavowal has been absolutely crucial to me in my work. And the ways in which, I mean, what Freud meant by disavowal was this process of both knowing and not knowing at exactly the same time. So you shield yourself, you split off a part of your mind, which is the part you don't want to know about, which of course can come up in dreams, it can come up in slips, it can come up in other ways. I mean, actually, there's an absolutely extraordinary dream that Edward Long recounts with no apparent recognition of what he's saying at all, that happens much later on. And he dreamt one night that he was returned to school. He was back at school and he was being beaten. And he remembered the beating and the humiliation. But he made no connection in his mind between that and his experience on the plantation. So at one level you think, how can people do it? But of course the fact is that people do it all the time. We do it all the time, absolutely. So, it's a everyday practice in life to both know and not know things and lock them off and partition your mind and split in your mind between things that you can accept, realities you can accept, and realities that you simply cannot live with. And that's what they were doing. But what's so fascinating about, I didn't mean to go into a discussion of disavowal, but it just comes up, What's so fascinating about what Freud says is that disavowal is always followed by an avowal. That is to say that whatever is being disavowed, it will come up what's being repressed. And this is one of the things that's so interesting about reading Long's history, precisely the way in which he both knows and chooses not to know. And of course, I mean, to cut to the second point that you were discussing, I mean, the history is a very, it's 3 huge volumes, massive, great volumes. I honestly don't think there are many people who've ever read it all except me. Lots of people have read the chapter on race. Lots of people have read that. But, the vast other quantities, of course, experts on particular, scholars look at particular things, but actually to follow the whole thing through and what he's doing. And what he's doing, as I've tried to explain here, is he is describing the system. And that's what's, that's what's come out to me so powerfully. But he's presenting it. I mean, it's a work of representation. Of course it is. All history writing is. It's not the truth. And, that may be obvious in the case of Edward Long. It's not always obvious to people that historians are not purely objective, that actually their subjective issues intervene in questions of who they write, what they write about, what their positionalities are, where they come from, all of that. And that's what I'm really interested in history writing as well as in Edward Long. So Long had to present Jamaica as a place that it was highly desirable to go to, because in order for Jamaica to be successful, it needed a larger white population. And the fact that the white population was not reproducing itself was rather disastrous. And that, as he himself did, as soon as people made enough money, they immediately left and came and lived in England or Scotland, because they didn't want to be there, and they left their plantations to be looked after by attorneys. So he had to represent Jamaica very positively. So this work of representation of, this spectacularly beautiful island, which of course it is a spectacularly beautiful island with this catastrophic history. All these elements are there in the history.
Thank you. Question, Mishka, can you take the microphone?